Women select men. That makes them nature, because nature is what selects. And so, you know, you can say, well, it's only symbolic that women are nature. It's like, no, it's not just symbolic. It's not just symbolic. You know, and the woman in some sense is the gatekeeper to not in some sense, is the gatekeeper to reproductive success. And you can't get more like nature than that. In fact, it's the very definition of nature. So, as I said, there are lots of reasons why these symbolic representations are set up the way they are.
It's been interesting to see what's happened with sex over the course of my lifetime. I mean, in the 60s, there was this idea, and it was probably the consequence of the birth control pill, that, well, maybe sex is free, right? It's free and easy. Because, well, now pregnancy wasn't necessarily a consequence, and venereal disease was reasonably well under control, and so wasn't a blatant threat, certainly not a fatal one. So people thought, well, why not free love? Well, I think the reason for that is it's complete rubbish. There's no free sex. If the act is serious, and you can debate about whether or not that is, and people have their differences of opinion, it's certainly emotionally significant in all likelihood. So if it's significant, well, then consent is important. Well, what constitutes consent? Well, marriage does. So that's where sex was encapsulated fundamentally, because the consent was never an issue. I mean, there's all sorts of things that weren't an issue because of that, and it wasn't like it was a magical solution to everything. But so, you know, because in the 60s, the idea was that sex could be casual. Well, AIDS pretty much put the end to that idea, at least in part, right? So, and it definitely spread as a consequence of promiscuity. That was definitely one of the driving factors that put AIDS everywhere. So that was not so good, to put it mildly. And then the reaction on campuses is, well, what constitutes consent? And the reason that has become questionable is because it's questionable. Unless it's not serious. But, you know, I don't think that people really believe that. So they might wish they believed it. But there's plenty of emotional damage done as a consequence of too quick intimacy. I think that's generally the case because in a partnership that becomes intimate, there's usually one person who's more emotionally invested than the other.
And the average success rate for the typical man is very low, but some men are hyper-procreative. Okay, so men are subject to selection pressure and many of them fail. Here's an interesting statistic. I think this came from Dataclysm, which is a book that was recently written about one of those online dating sites. But he was looking at things like how the typical woman on the dating site rates the typical man. It's pretty funny, eh? Because men actually rate women on a normal distribution. So the typical woman scores at the 50th percentile, and half of them are above average and half of them are below. What do you think the equivalent is for women rating men? And everyone laughs, especially the women. So what do you think it is? It's 85-15. 85% of men are below average. Yeah, it's annoying, you know, unless you happen to be one of the 15% who isn't. You know, and those are the 15% of the guys who are having all the sexual encounters in a relatively sexually liberated environment too. Okay, so why am I telling you all this? If you track women through their ovulation cycle and you show them a picture of a man, the same man, and you do nothing but vary his jaw width, when they're ovulating, the guy with the wider jaw is more attractive, and when they're not ovulating, the farthest away from that, the guy with the thinner jaw is more attractive, and that's associated with testosterone levels. And so women who are fertile like more masculine men, and basically if you're on the pill, then you're never in that ovulation phase. And so one thing that may have happened, and I don't know this for sure, but it's interesting to consider, is that since women have been taking the birth control pill, their preference for less masculine men has become more pronounced. And that could easily be one of the things that's fueling at least some of the tension that's existed and exists now politically between men and women. But the point is that you just cannot ignore the massive consequences of a biological revolution like that, and to make any other factor causal when you're trying to understand the political movements, especially in the last, say, 40 years, you're putting the cart before the horse. Now, it's reasonable to point out that the pill wouldn't have been accepted as a technology if certain political changes with regards to the emancipation of women hadn't already been in place, right? No one would have even been allowed to do something like investigate contraception. So you can't separate the biological from the political entirely, but it's still very useful to organizing your thinking to realize just how profound a revolution that was. But now back in the Victorian times, see, there's another thing about sexuality. Modern people like to think that there's nothing dangerous about sex, and that is like the stupidest thing you could possibly ever hypothesize, because everything about it is dangerous. It's dangerous emotionally, it's dangerous socially, it's dangerous because of the possibility of unwanted pregnancy, and it's dangerous because of the possibility of sickness, and that's a major one. I mean, so when AIDS emerged in the 1980s, that could have easily killed all of us. Now, the fact that it didn't was wonderful, but it did kill hundreds of millions of people. So it was no joke, it was a big deal, and AIDS mutated to take advantage of promiscuity. And so the relationship between sexual behavior and the transmission of disease is actually mediated at the biological level. But anyways, back in the 1890s, they had the same problem, right? They had the problem with syphilis. And syphilis is one nasty disease. It can mimic almost any other disease, and it's devastating to your nervous system, and you can pass it on to your children. And so part of the reason that sexuality was heavily repressed in the Victorian period was not only because of the possibility of unwanted pregnancy, the relative poverty of people. You know, back in 1895 in Europe, the average person lived on less than $1 a day in modern terms. You know, it's almost impossible to understand how poor people were. And so sex in a poverty-stricken place is also a lot more dangerous than it is in a rich place, because especially if given the lack of employment opportunities for women back in the Victorian period, if you happened to get pregnant out of wedlock, you were in serious trouble. And so the fact that sexuality was repressed is hardly a surprise, because it was so difficult to integrate into the full-fledged personality, you know, and as it still is. So sexual repression, supposedly characteristic feature of the Victorian period, was often merely the expression of two facts: the lack of diffusion of contraceptives and the fear of venereal disease. It was all the more dangerous because of the great spread of prostitution, and because prostitutes were almost invariably contaminated and therefore potential sources of infection. We can hardly imagine today how monstrous syphilis appeared to people of that time. Well, we can imagine it a little bit better than they could in 1970, because it hasn't, you know, AIDS is still with us, although it's nowhere near the plague that it was, say, 25 years ago.